Yeah, I think one was there was a idolizing of unfettered markets. And much, if not most, of the intelligentsia were duped. I recall traveling with my dear brother Michael Harrington or talking with Brother Stanley Aronowitz years ago. And, you know, here we're engaged in critiques of unfettered markets, and it looked as if we were medieval thinkers. Everybody was saying we're followers of Milton Friedman. Everybody was saying Frederick Hayek got it right. Everybody was saying marketize, commercialize, commodify. And we were still reading Lukács. And Lukács was saying commodification is not simply an asymmetric relation of power of bosses vis-a-vis workers. So workers are being more and more marginalized. Profits are being produced, wealth is being produced, hemorrhaged at the top, no fair distribution of that wealth or profit for workers. Poor are being demonized because they are viewed as those persons who are irresponsible, who will not work, who are always looking for welfare, i.e. failures in the society of success. And we reached the brink and the chickens came home to roost. And a few years ago, the unfettered markets led us off and over the brink. And all of a sudden, very few intellectuals want to be honest and acknowledge the degree to which they were duped. Don't want to talk about the inequality that went along with it. Don't want to talk about the demonization of the poor that went along with it. Don't want to talk about the politics of fear that produced a Republican Party that was more and more lily white, using not just race, but also demonizing gay brothers and lesbian sisters, you see. Don't want to talk about the indifference toward the poor and greed being good and desirable and so forth. Now it's a very different moment. And it's not, you know, just a matter of pointing fingers, but saying somebody's got to take responsibility for this. This was a nearly 40-year run. Who paid the cost? As usually the case, you know, poor working people paid the cost, disproportionately black and brown and red.
A major criticism you hear among some black leaders, among some black politicians and activists these days, is the way in which so-called wokeness and call-out culture, quote unquote, have become substitutes for genuine action, for social movements that you yourself have always believed are necessary for change. Do you share that criticism? It's come from different corners, from people associated with Black Lives Matter, from Barack Obama, from other people saying you have to get out there. It can't just be, you know, going on Twitter and calling people out. Do you agree with that criticism, or do you think it's unfair?
Well, I think the first thing to say is fundamentally it's not about identity, it's about solidarity. It's not about your skin pigmentation, it's about the quality of your courage connected to poor and working people. I don't believe in canceling anybody. I mean, Christians don't believe in canceling people. Everybody can bounce back. I believe everybody's a brother and sister, and they have the capacity to be changed and transformed. So I don't believe in canceling anybody whatsoever. But I do, in fact, say that when we talk about wokeness, I'm not talking about just being woke, because you can be obsessed with wokeness and suffer from insomnia. I'm talking about being fortified. Are you a fighter in the long run? We don't want people woke and sprinters and run out of gas, and the next thing you know, they end up well-adjusted to injustice. That's like so much of the bourgeoisies, no matter what color they are. Middle-class folk that just can't wait to be engaged in upward mobility in order to go mainstream and become a new star with all the spectacle and overlook what's going on the ground of people who are suffering. That's not the model. The model is Martin King, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Ella Baker. What are they talking about? Fortified. Are you fortified for the long run? Do you have your cemetery clothes on? Are you coffin ready to live and die for something bigger than you, like a fundamental transformation of a capitalist civilization? That's my tradition.
All we have is two parties. It's freak and frack. It's Tweedledee and Tweedledum. There is a difference domestically, but not a whole lot of difference in terms of foreign policy. You ask Palestinian brothers on the West Bank, and they got the various bombs coming at them, and 550 Palestinian children are killed in 50 days. Somewhere I read or somewhere I heard in Vacation Bible School in Shiloh Baptist Church, Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world, red or yellow, black or white. They are precious in His sight. A Palestinian child has exactly the same value as a precious Jewish child. An oppressed Jewish child has exactly the same value as a oppressed black, or red, or indigenous, or anywhere else, Ethiopian, Lithuanian, and so forth. And you ask the black politician, how come you won't say a mumbling word about the Palestinians undergoing that kind of suffering? They're on the gravy train. They've adjusted themselves.
Share with us your thoughts about how the world of race, the world of the color line, as Du Bois put it, how's it changed over the last 60 years or so, particularly when we see the rise of white supremacy rearing its ugly head in ways that many of us thought naively would be impossible. But it's here.
Yeah. You know, part of it, though, Brother Skip, is that we've too often lost sight of what Martin Luther King Jr. and Fannie Lou Hamer, John Coltrane's Love Supreme, Stevie Wonder's Love in Need of Love was all about. Because what happened was race became a construct that was disconnected from class, disconnected from empire, and even disconnected from gender, even though gender tried to get in. And so many people began to think, well, the struggle against white supremacy is the struggle for success in the predatory capitalist structure and success within the empire. That was one of the reasons why when we got a black face of the American empire, folks started breakdancing, making MC Hammer look like a Cub Scout. Now, I was breakdancing too, but just for a few hours. Because I knew when my dear brother Barack Obama, who I'd worked so very hard for 65 events for free, I knew that was because of the blood, sweat, and tears of all the folk before. Hundreds of years of sacrifice before. He didn't do it all by himself. But once race was disconnected from class and empire, and once race no longer made it a priority to begin with the least of these, that's the biblical criteria. What's happening on the block? Mass incarceration regime. What's happening with the decrepit school systems? What's happening with the indecent housing? What's happening with massive unemployment and underemployment? What's happening with bombs being dropped around the world? I mean, Brother Barack Obama won a Peace Prize. He had 6 wars going on at the same time. He's dropping 25,000 bombs every year, but he got a Peace Prize. And you say, hey, what's going on? That's Marvin Gaye's question. What's going on? I call it a Keith Sweat moment. Something just ain't right. Something just ain't right. We can love Obama because he's struggling against white supremacy. We can love Obama because he's brilliant. We can love Obama because his wife is magnificent and his children are precious. But if he's dropping bombs, he's dropping bombs. If his drones are killing poor people in Somalia and Pakistan, Bush had 45. I call Bush a war criminal. Obama had 563. He's a war criminal. And they say, Brother West, how come you're so hard on the brother? How come, don't you know he's black? I love the brother. That's why I'm telling him the truth. But I'm also committed to the people who are suffering. We have solidarity in the face of catastrophe. Let us march together. Let us fight together. Let us laugh together. Let us dance together. Let us smile together. Let us cry together. We will not allow the organized greed to have the last word. Love supreme or love supreme.
It takes tremendous discipline, takes tremendous courage to think for yourself, to examine yourself. That Socratic imperative of examining yourself requires courage. You know, William Butler Yeats used to say, it takes more courage to examine the dark corners of your own soul than it does for a soldier to fight on the battlefield. Courage to think critically. Courage is the enabling virtue for any philosopher, for any human being, I think, in the end.
People to carry out nonviolent civil disobedience. A couple of dozen people linked arms and were arrested.
Princeton University professor Cornel West was one of 19 people arrested on the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court during a protest against money in politics.
You're joking! Are you denying us access to a public building?
And we here because we want to keep the family center stage.
whiteness can't be reduced to white supremacy. You got a whole lot of white brothers and sisters fighting against white supremacy.
We got a choice between neo-fascists like Brother Trump or milquetoast neoliberals like Brother Biden. Wow, I'm so happy to make a world-shaking decision. You know what I mean?
You almost agreed with me.
No, not at all.
See, your solar plexus winds towards my direction.
No,
I got it wrong.
All right.
You got to come back more often. We miss you.
Democrats feeding the Republicans, Republicans feeding the Democrats, and yet poor people, working people, finding themselves pushed to the margins. I believe a Palestinian baby has the same value as an Israeli baby.
We have to have people who are in solidarity, who get beyond their petty differences and be able to hold hands symbolically and literally and fight by straightening your backs up.
We stand in solidarity with anybody who's occupied, anybody who's subjugated, anybody who's exploited, and that's why we focus on Gaza at this moment, because a genocidal attack is taking place.
Yeah.
10,000 dead and 4,000 precious children. And don't let anybody tell you that because you love Palestinians and Palestinian babies, that you hate somebody else. It just doesn't follow what our brothers and sisters. We don't hate Jewish brothers. We don't hate Jewish sisters. We don't hate Jewish siblings. We hate a vicious Israeli occupation. We loathe and we hate a vicious siege against Gaza. And the least we can do at this moment of overwhelming barbarity is have a ceasefire. And yet you got these cowards in Washington, D.C. talking about a humanitarian pause. Please get off the crack pipe. Wake up. See the humanity of precious Palestinian brothers and sisters.
The great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel used to say, indifference to evil is more insidious than evil itself. George Bernard Shaw says in The Devil's Discipline, the early play, indifference is the essence of inhumanity. And one of my heroes, the greatest man of letters in America ever, William James, said indifference is the one trait that makes the very angels weep. The expansion of indifference to other people's suffering is the most dangerous phenomena in the world.
Well, what has happened, I think, recently is the chickens have come home to roost, which is to say that the deep imperial project tied to predatory capitalism, tied to white supremacy at its center, male supremacy too, have now created a situation in which the people feel as if there is no possibility of rendering these elites accountable. And so they hit the streets. I mean, that's what happens when reform seems to be impossible. So even though we're in a euphoric moment now where we got these marvelous human beings of all colors, genders, religious identities on the street, you can be assured that the police elites, the Wall Street elites, the Pentagon elites, and the president, and by president, I don't just mean a gangster named Trump. I'm not talking about just that neo-fascist in the White House. The president of any party that's beholden to Wall Street, beholden to the militarism of Pentagon. We got too much decadent black leadership. We got too much decadent white leadership. We got too much decadent brown leadership, locked into very narrow neoliberal modes that don't really want to tell the full truth. We have to hit that head on. Now, of course, we've got the vicious leadership of neo-fascists like Trump, but it's so easy to fetishize him and downplay the role that neoliberal elites have also played in terms of the way they've contributed to the militarizing of the police, the rendering invisible of the black brothers and sisters who have been shot for the last 40 years. That's under both Democrats and Republicans. And then to connect that to the deaths of that result from Wall Street greed, big pharmaceutical companies' greed, the way in which poverty kills, the decrepit school system, dilapidated housing, unavailable health care. People are dying.
The blues man, of course, or the blues woman is someone who begins with the catastrophic. See, the blues is an autobiographical chronicle of personal catastrophe expressed lyrically. So it's a lyrical response to the monstrous. It's like the first sentence of Kafka's A Metamorphosis. Gregor Samson grows up from wakes up from an uneasy dream, finds himself transformed in bed to a huge vile vermin. That's catastrophic. That's catastrophic. Situation of poor people is catastrophic. Black people had slavery, Jim Crow, Jane Crow, catastrophic. What was the response? It wasn't create a black Al-Qaeda. It wasn't counter-terroristic. In the face of slavery, Frederick Douglass said what? With a smile and wounds, we want freedom for everybody. We don't want to enslave others just because we're enslaved. Jim Crow, we have no rights and liberties. We're civically dead. We want rights and liberties for everybody. Right? We don't want to Jim Crow somebody else. The blues responds to the catastrophic with compassion, without drinking from the cup of bitterness. Not with revenge, but with justice. That's the best of the blues, you see. And so the blues people in America have been the leaven in the democratic loaf, because black people could have chosen counter-terroristic tactics when they were lynched over and over and over again. They said, no, we're not going to go out and lynch white folk. We would rather be defeated for the moment with integrity than win and be a gangster like them. That's a blues sensibility. That's a blues sensibility. So you let that love inside of you be expressed, even though it's hard for it to be translated into love or justice on the ground. That's a great lesson in this age of terrorism and in the age of recession, you see. And so a blues man like myself in the life of the mind, a jazz man in the world of ideas says, I want to tell the truth. The condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. And as a Christian, I believe in unconditional love. That's why I love Brother Larry Summers. I want him to have more joy in his life. It's hard to have a lot of arrogance and have a lot of joy at the same time. I want him to have more joy and less arrogance. But unconditional love is always tied to justice. Justice is love on legs spilling over into the public sphere. A different institutional array of sources of what a blues sensibility. Now keep in mind, by blues sensibility, what I have in part in mind is a tragicomics view in which compassion responds to catastrophe. See, in that sense, Walter Benjamin is a blues man, and the thesis on philosophy of history in the ninth thesis, you see, that history is catastrophe, a pilage of records upon records, that pile of debris, but the response is messianic, is weak, but the messianic is what? To keep alive the memory of those who struggled before, based on their compassion for the poor, you see, based on their attempt to resist the powers that be. So that by blues, I don't mean just a particular art form. It's really a way of life that art form helped popularize. So even in the media, in the context of the media, you can be a blues person without even being able to sing. Because you can have a tragicomic sensibility that keeps track of the catastrophes all around us. It could be personal catastrophes, heartbreak. It could be shipwreck of the mind, intellectual catastrophe. It could be social catastrophe, crisis. It could be Wall Street catastrophe for the well-to-do and others. And then the catastrophe that's always in place for the poor. Always at work with housing, education, unemployment. 60s sensibilities where people had a love for poor people. It wasn't a condescension of helping out. We had a love for poor people. We love poor people's music like Curtis Mayfield. We love poor people's music, the genius that came out of the ghettos, the Donny Hathaways and others, you see. And it was also true on the other side, the Bruce Springsteens, the white blues men out of the working classes of New Jersey, you see. And they weren't geniuses because they're working class, but they were extraordinarily ordinary people who happened to be geniuses in their genres. And that was the Sly Stones, everyday people who we love. Everybody's a star, Sly Stone. That's what shaped and molded me. And I am old school to the core, unapologetic. Motown, Stax, Philly, International Sound, Curtis Mayfield, Al Green, Aretha, W.E.B. Du Bois, Leroy Jones, transferring into Baraka, but especially allowing, because as a Christian, I start with black people in terms of my love, but it spills over to white brothers and sisters, brown, red, yellow, across the board. So I believe in spillover love. And since justice is what love looks like in public, you can't talk about loving folk if you're not fighting for justice, especially beginning with the least of these. So in the age of Obama, we say, okay, can we have a different kind of discussion? And that's what we're trying to do, but of course you got two wars going on. You got still Wall Street in the driver's seat in the Obama administration when it comes to the economic team, you see. And you've got very, I think in some ways unimaginative thinking when it comes to foreign policy. Be it the Middle East, or be it European Union, or be it Latin America, calling Chavez a dictator. The man's been elected. If he's calling into question rights and liberties, criticize him as a Democratic president. We did the same thing for Bush. Bush was calling into question rights and liberties. We didn't call him a dictator. We said he's a Democratic elected president who's doing the wrong thing. Chavez ought to be criticized. He's not a dictator. The man's been elected. But it's that kind of demonizing that obscures and obfuscates the kinds of issues that are necessary, because Chavez is also talking about poor people. Of course, I want libertarian and democratic sides. I want rights and liberties and empowerment of poor people. But talking about poor people is not a joke. It's crucial. It's part and parcel of the future of any serious democratic project. The fundamental question of any democracy is, what is the relation between public interest and the most vulnerable? That's the question. You see? That is the question. Your test of your rule of law is going to be, how are the most vulnerable being treated? It's not whether the torturers are getting off. We know the torturers don't have a rule of law applied to them. The wiretappers, they're getting off scot-free. What about Jamal with the crackback, taken to jail for 7 years? Oh, so you got a different rule of law when it comes to Jamal on the corner versus your torturers and your wiretappers? Torturing is a crime against humanity. It's not just illegal. Wiretapping is illegal. You see, now it's not a crime against humanity, because sure, I've had my phone tapped for years. I don't think they're committing a crime against humanity. Just ought to quit doing it, goddamn. Keep in mind, the demos is always heterogeneous, diverse. Got a lot of xenophobic elements among the demos, a lot of ignorance, a lot of parochialism. You also have a lot of cosmopolitanism, a lot of globalism, a lot of courage, moral courage. So the demos is not one thing. But when it comes to the ability of the demos to organize, mobilize, and bring power and pressure to bear, we certainly are in a crisis. Our system is broken. We got 71% of people who want universal health care, and you can barely get through a reform bill with a weak public option. It's clear lobbyists from the top, pharmaceutical companies, drug companies have tremendous influence, much more than the demos from below, you see. So those preferences don't get translated easily, because our politicians are beholden to that big money and that big influence. But the demos is still around, thank God. You got your own institution, right? Dialogue. Dialogue is the lifeblood of a democracy. We got to allow ideas to flow. You have to expose people to different visions, alternative arguments, and so on, to try to keep the torch of the progressive demos alive. But it's very difficult to organize it. Complacency is deep. Apathy is deep. People are wondering, how can you confront, big finance, big government tied to big finance, when all you got is these little people who are willing to talk and so forth, but have tremendous power, bringing serious pressure to bear. We can march. We marched against the war by the millions. We were ignored by the Bush administration. Some of us went to jail. We were ignored. We couldn't translate the foreign policy. That happened sometimes. It was different in Vietnam. And I think one of the saddest features of our day is American culture is more and more beginning to look like a Hamlet-like condition. Now, Hamlet, as you know, is the most sophisticated philosophical protagonist in all of modern literature, written by the greatest bard in the English the language that many of us dream in, Shakespeare.
No, we've got some Spanish brothers and sisters, so I don't want to be culturally imperialist about this. If you dreaming in the language of Cervantes, that's a beautiful thing. That's beautiful too. Oh yes, the language of Goethe in German or whatever. But the important thing is, Hamlet suffers from the inability to love. And Dostoevsky and the Brothers Karamazov says, hell is defined by those who suffer from the inability to love. Well, American culture more and more becomes a joyless quest for pleasure, insatiable pleasure, never get enough of it, endless, bottomless, and the inability to really be committed to love. Because love is a form of death. And you have to learn how to die in order to learn how to love. That's why the New Testament says what? Christians must die daily. Die daily. Well, the culture's joyless quest for pleasure is a denial of death. That's why we can easily deny those locked into social death. We can deny those locked into civic death. Those wrestling with psychic death. Spiritual death. We were talking before about wrestling with the issue of mental illness, and you and Kay have been magnificent in your courage. And I've been praying.
Thank you.
Magnificent in your courage. But the ways in which it's so easy to lose sight of the precious humanity of those wrestling with the mental illness. I mean, I've been to jail so many times, and at least 1 out of 3 of the brothers and sisters in my cell are wrestling with mental illness.
Sure.
And unable to get medication. And they tend to stand there longer than me, and I stand there long enough. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to get out. But in talking about disagreement, we're not just talking about something political. We're not just talking about even something civil. We're talking about something spiritual. You see, something profoundly spiritual. And for Christians, it is inescapably spiritual. You see. And in the end, of course, it's an acknowledgement of having a hermeneutical humility and an intellectual humility, acknowledging that you could be wrong, and there's a good chance that you are at times wrong. But you're still willing to stand in your truth and try to speak your truth and opt for a deep integrity rather than a cheap popularity. Because so oftentimes in America, to be popular is to be well adjusted to injustice. Well, see, that's not the kind of popularity Christians ought to be interested in.
That's right.
To be popular, being well adapted to indifference. That's not the kind of popularity Christians ought to be interested in. The benchmark of the Christian way of life, of the way of the cross, is there goes some of those strange folk who look like they're fools in the eyes of the world, who are still trying to love against the grain, knowing that justice is what love looks like in public. Just like tenderness is what love feels like in private. And you say, oh, those are those strange ones. That's where it was in the early church, wasn't it? Those are those strange ones still talking about love, obsessed with that Palestinian Jew named Jesus who was enacting, embodying that love. You say, yes, that's right, you got it right. That's right, you got it right. That's what we're about. So in that sense, I do want to begin on that pietistic note and a spiritual note. Because I'll end, I think Reinhold Niebuhr put it so well when he said, any justice that's only justice soon degenerates into something less than justice.
Good point. Yeah.
Justice must be rescued by something much more deeper than justice, which is love. Love of truth, love of neighbor, and for me, love of enemy. And we won't go into that now, but I think that's very, very important. Because it means then even your foe is part of the human family. and in some ways an extension of your own humanity. Because for most of us, I know in my case, that I was a gangster before I met Jesus, and now I'm a redeemed sinner with gangster proclivities.
I come from the school of thought that believes that a certain kind of atheism is always healthy.
Amen.
Yes, sir. Amen. I tell that to my dear brother Bill Maher all the time, you see. Because what atheism does, it at least cleans the deck. Yes, because sir. It claims that all gods are idols. And most gods are idols.
Yes, sir.
It's just that the prophetic traditions, be it Judaism, Islam, or Christianity, are tied to this God of love and justice. But because we live in a society in which idolatry is so ubiquitous, you view life as a gold rush. So you end up worshiping a golden calf. And the golden rule becomes only those who have the gold will rule. That's idolatry all the way down. So a lot of folk who've lost faith in God, it's a very healthy thing because the God that they've lost faith in was probably an idol anyway.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And the challenge becomes, are you still open enough and vulnerable enough in your soul to be open to something bigger than you that's connected to a love and justice, to honesty, decency, and integrity? Secular folk will have their language for it. Jewish brothers and sisters will have their language. Islamic brothers and sisters will have their language. And some of us will still put Jesus at the center of it, you see. But at least you've cleared the deck for the idolatry, because it's so difficult, especially in our society, not to be seduced by the idols.
Yes, sir.
In the academy, everybody wants to be smart. That's nothing but idolatry. Nothing but idolatry. Let the phones be smart. You got to be wise. You have to have courage. You have to have a willingness to take a risk and be vulnerable. Smart folk don't like to do that. Smart folk, after making big money and status. No, one's tied to love and justice. They got to be improvisational, flexible, fluid, jazz-like, knowing they could hit the wrong note. That's all right. Sometimes wrong is right, as Monk used to say. That's all right. But you're going to keep playing anyway, and maybe listen a little bit closer when Train hits that chord and you hit something you didn't know was even on the piano, because together in community, you can do something you didn't even conceive you could do before.
Yes, sir.
That's, for me, what part of the challenge is. Most of human history is the history of domination. Most of human history is the history of oppression, the history of hatred, contempt, envy, resentment. How do you break that cycle? How do you create moments of interruption that can be sustained? If you're really going to have to come to terms with the history of black people in the States, you're talking about slavery, Jim Crow, police brutality, self-hatred, self-violation, self-flagellation. You're really dealing with psychic, spiritual, social, political catastrophes. Democracy is the hearing and heeding of the voices of the victims of hierarchies that have been in place that have dominated and exploited people. And so what's fascinating about the United States, it's always been paradoxical. The American Revolution was both an interruption of the rule of empires. It was anti-imperial in a magnificent way, but it continued with forms of domination. That's why it was an imperial democracy. It continued with forms of domination vis-a-vis indigenous peoples, African slaves, white working men and women, women across the board, of course. So what is at stake is an imperial meltdown, the spiritual blackout. And what is a spiritual blackout? It is the relative eclipse of empathy, courage, integrity, honesty, decency, so that to be a gangster becomes the dominant way of life. I'm going to do anything to get over. I'm going to do anything to be successful. I'm going to do anything to get money. It's money, power, fame becomes the fundamental pillars upon which too many young folk are socialized, because that's what they see in the imperial meltdown that we're experiencing. It's just a matter of trying to be honest, trying to be truthful, trying to be frank. That's what it's all about. How do you sustain a democratic hope in bleak times? Probably the most sublime feature, morally sublime feature of the species is that no matter how pervasive the domination is, it tends not to completely suffocate love, tenderness, struggles for justice, fighting for the poor, fighting for the vulnerable. The sparks of love of truth, the sparks of the love of justice, the sparks of the love of beauty, the sparks of the love of something bigger than oneself. There's something about the attempt to intervene and turn us around into our best. The shaking of we sleepwalkers into modes of awakening. So we become not just aware of others' suffering, but we identify with that suffering enough to want to do something about it. The history of the species at its best has to do with those who are willing to risk much, sometimes risking it all, to exemplify the grandest ideals. You have to try to ascend up the stairs to be a higher self, given the self that you are at the moment, and try to rely on that higher self and not that established self in place. I come from a people who have been terrorized, traumatized, and stigmatized extremist measures for 400 years. And I submit to you, I am who I am because somebody loved me. Somebody cared for me. Somebody attended to me. So I've always aspired to be an extremist when it comes to freedom and liberty, extremist when it comes to love, because I learned in the West family, Irene and Clifton and Shiloh Baptist Church of Reverend Willard P. Cook, who taught me to be human is to be an extremist for love. Yes. To be human is to be a subversive for sweetness. To be human is to be a radical for gentleness. And James Baldwin writes in that magnificent essay in Esquire magazine in April of 1972, Brother Malcolm X was the most gentlest of people he ever met. But it was hard to keep track of his gentleness, because when you love folk, especially love those Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth, you hate the fact they're being treated unjustly. Yes. And you loathe the fact that they're being treated unfairly, and that's why I have a hatred of the drones being dropped on my precious brothers and sisters in Somalia and in Yemen and in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. Oh yes. I've got a hatred of how my Dalit brothers and sisters are treated in India. I have a hatred of how peasants are treated in Mexico. I will never forget the tears of my precious sister Leslie McSpadden when I was sitting there with hands praying over the space where Brother Michael Brown's body lay for 4.5 hours with blood flowing on that street. We were praying at midnight hour, and lo and behold, who comes around the corner but Leslie herself? She says, my spirit was restless. I said, mine was too. Join the prayer circle. Be part of the legacy of Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass. Be part of the legacy of Fannie Lou Hamer. Be part of the legacy of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Be part of the legacy of a white sister named Dorothy Day or Ann Braden. That legacy says what? You start with the tears of those who have been terrorized and traumatized and stigmatized. This is no academic game. This is no theoretical puzzle. You're talking about what kind of human being are you going to choose to be in your brief move from mama's womb to tomb. That's what we're talking about. This is no plaything.
This is no plaything. Extremism in defense of liberty is not just no vice. You've got to understand that the liberty is rooted in the love supreme of John Coltrane, of Curtis Mayfield and Bob Marley and Nina Simone and a host of others too. Why? Because any liberty that's only liberty soon degenerates into something less than liberty. Liberty is rescued only by something greater than liberty, namely the love. And I am proud to say that I come from a black people, a grand people, in the face of 400 years of terrorism, refuse to just hate the terrorists, but rather love the justice in such a way that it taught the nation and the world something about love and justice. That's what Malcolm X stood for, y'all. He stood for a love so deep inside of him that it had to flow, and it flowed for a while just on the chocolate side of town. He couldn't understand white brothers and sisters being devilish and not also being devils. He was wrong. White brothers and sisters not devils, but they often act devilish. Yeah. He learned that lesson. He learned that lesson. We got the author of our text right here, Saladin Ambar, wrote that magnificent book on Malcolm X, Oxford Debate. Read that text. See the way black love goes hand in hand with righteous indignation, holy anger, moral outrage, and it looks as if it's hatred, but it's only black revenge and hatred if you're still in a white supremacist bubble because you're obsessed with your own fears, your own anxieties, your own insecurity. Allow that love to flow. And if you have trouble with it, then turn on a little Aretha Franklin. Listen to a little Thelonious Monk. They're part of the same tradition. It's called the Caravan of Love that the Isley Brothers sang about. It's the same love train that Curtis Mayfield was talking about in People Get Ready. It's the same redemption that Bob Marley was talking about. The tradition of Malcolm X is a human one, but it was rooted in a response to 400 years of terror and trauma and stigma. And therefore, when we reflect on this proposition, keep in mind that it's not just some academic sentence, but it's rooted in blood and sweat and tears, like Emmett Till's mama when she stood and looked at her baby and looked at the world and said, I refuse to hate. I will pursue justice for the rest of my life. That's the kind of liberty I want to defend. That's why I'm here today. We are witnessing America as a failed social experiment. And what I mean by that is that the history of black people for over 200 and some years in America has been looking at America's failure. Its capitalist economy could not generate and deliver in such a way that people could live lives of decency. The nation state, its criminal justice system, its legal system could not generate protection of rights and liberties. And now our culture, of course, is so market-driven, everybody for sale, everything for sale. It can't deliver the kind of really real nourishment for soul, for meaning, for purpose. And so when you get this perfect storm of all of these multiple failures at these different levels of the American empire, and Martin King already told us about that. When I saw those pictures there in Atlanta, you could see Martin right there in Atlanta saying, I told you about militarism, I told you about poverty, I told you about materialism, I told you about racism and all of its forms, whatever forms it takes. I told you about xenophobia. And what we've seen in America is now these chickens coming home to roost. You're reaping what you sow. And in this instant, you have Brother George, where it is so clear it is a lynching at the highest level. Nobody can deny it. And I thank God that we have people in the streets. Now you've got a younger generation of all of these different colors and genders and sexual orientations saying, we won't take it any longer. But you know what's sad about it though, brother? At the deepest level? It looks as if the system cannot reform itself. We've tried black faces in high places
Too often our black politicians, professional class, middle class, become too accommodated to the capitalist economy, too accommodated to the militarized nation state, too accommodated to the market-driven culture tied with celebrity status, power, fame, all of that superficial stuff that means so much to so many fellow citizens. And what happens? What happens is we got a neo-fascist gangster in the White House who really doesn't care for the most part. You got a neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party that is now in the driver's seat with the collapse of Brother Bernie, and they don't really know what to do because all they want is show more black faces, show more black faces. But oftentimes these black faces are losing legitimacy too, because the Black Lives Matter movement emerged under a black president, black attorney general, and black Homeland Security, and they couldn't deliver, you see? So that when you talk about the masses of black people, the precious poor and working class black people, poor and working class brown, red, yellow, whatever color, they're the ones who are left out, and they feel so thoroughly powerless, helpless, hopeless. Then you get rebellion. And we've reached the point now, it's a choice between nonviolent revolution. And by revolution, what I mean is the democratic sharing of power, resources, wealth, and respect. If we don't get that kind of sharing, you're going to get more violent explosions. Now, the sad thing is, in this neo-fascist moment in the White House, you've got some neo-fascist brothers and sisters out there who are already armed. They show up there at the U.S. Capitol, and they don't get arrested. They don't get put down. Even the president praises them. You see what I mean?
And of course, I'm a mama's child and my daddy's kid. Irene and Lake Clifton West. That West family is just so precious. I was saturated with love that's beyond description. I don't have a language. The words cannot convey the kind of love that I received. And it was inseparable from Shiloh Baptist Church. Reverend Willie P. Cook, my pastor. Head of the deacon board, Deacon Hinton. My Sunday school teacher, Sarah Ray. Fundamental for me. My little league coach, Mr. Peters. My cross-country coach, Bill Mahan. I mean, all of these magnificent human beings shaped me in fundamental ways. At the same time, I was full of rage. I had a Robin Hood mentality that I tended to coerce people and take their money to make sure that people who had no money had something, because I couldn't stand to see the weak used and abused. And I was wrong to be coercive in that way. But I needed to find a positive channel for my rage. Beat up my teacher when I was in 3rd grade, refused to salute the flag. Why? I had a great uncle who was lynched, and they wrapped his body with the U.S. flag as he hung from the tree in Jim Crow, Texas. It was in my mind at 8 years old, so I refused to salute the flag. Mrs. Yee, lovely teacher that she was, slapped me. I had a Joe Frazier counterpunch, hit her. The principal jumped on me. My brother and his partner jumped on the principal. A riot was on. Get kicked out of school. No school would take me. My mother was kind enough to have me take an IQ test. I got about 160-something, and they said, this little Negro has some potential. They sent me over to another school across the way. So I went from the chocolate side of town to the vanilla side of town, Earl Warren Elementary School. Had a wonderful time. 2 white sisters who were magnificent, Nona Saul and Cecilia Angel, helped me channel my rage. And so I'm still full of rage, but now it's a righteous indignation at injustice. It's not the kind of gangster orientation that's full of revenge and bitterness and so forth. That had something to do with the power of love, my Christian faith, which I hold on to, intend to be faithful unto death, but it's self-style. It goes through Chekhov, goes through Samuel Beckett, who are 2 of the great lapsed Christians. 2 of the great agnostics, probably 2 of the greatest writers of the 20th century, actually, Chekhov and Beckett. Can't live without them. Kafka would be the other for me, another agnostic in that sense. Full of love, though. Gregor Samson in the Metamorphosis, full of deep love and compassion for family, especially his violin-playing sister Greta. They mean much to me. But it's the power of love, that power of education, connecting life of the mind, the struggle for justice. That's my story.
But let's just be very honest. We live in a moment of such overwhelming spiritual decay, lack of empathy, lack of imagination of what it's like to be in the shoes of somebody else, to walk a mile in those shoes, get inside of somebody else's skin, get out of your egocentric predicament, get beyond your silo, get beyond your little narrow truncated community, and get a sense of what the world is actually like. There's a whole lot of different people out there.
All the folk who follow Trump are not neo-fascists, but they're conservative, and they're based, and it's motivated by one fundamental fact. They have a profound hatred of the professional managerial class that they see as the winners of corporate globalization, and they associate that with black people, with Jews, with gay brothers, lesbian sisters, trans, and used to be Catholics, but I ran into David Duke down there, and he's now head of one of the Klan groups. That's American, upward mobility American style. They have a Catholic now running the Klan, and the Klan began by hating Catholics, Jews, and black folk. And we're going to see more of that as well. You're going to see more Jewish folks supporting the neo-fascists. You're going to see more black folks supporting the neo-fascists. That's where we are now.
Every politician has got to be able to seize the moment and let the world know you are a fighter for those who have been spit on, subjugated, dominated, exploited. They can't live vicariously through your symbolic success. Now, how you gonna use your success? You see, are you gonna continue to bend whatever you can, your authority and influence to try to empower poor and working people? See, success and greatness is not the same thing for me. Success is being in a position of authority, power, and influence. Greatness is what you do with it.
The thing about indifference that it's always a choice that we make, you see. So that if you choose to have an iciness of soul and a hardening of heart and a coarsening of conscience, that leads toward indifference. That's why at the end of Dante's Inferno, it's the iciness of Satan. You remember? The coldness. That's a choice. No matter what structures of domination are in place, we can still choose to care. Choose to care. Sorge, that fundamental category that the Germans talked about. So the care. And the blues man and the blues woman don't believe in optimism or pessimism. I've been down so long that down don't worry me no more. That's why I keep keeping on. The blues man and the blues woman are never indifferent. They're full of passion. They're full of caring about something. It could be last night, tomorrow night, could be the society, whatever. You got to sustain some kind of passion. And therefore, the great blues men and women, from Toni Morrison to white ones like Tennessee Williams to Bruce Springsteen on the vanilla side of town, along with Bob Dylan, or on the chocolate side of town, you know, it could be Leroy Carr or Curtis Mayfield or Aretha Franklin. They are prisoners of hope. They're neither optimists nor pessimists. They are prisoners of hope because they care. As long as you care, and there's one little precious child out there with sparkling eyes, you've got to do something, and if you don't, the rocks are gonna cry out. That's why Coltrane kept blowing his horn, my brother. Because if he didn't blow his horn, the rocks were gonna cry out. That genius cared.
And so anytime you talk about love, you're talking about two things that most people don't want to talk about. First thing you're talking about is courage. Courage is that enabling virtue that makes all the other virtues possible. And if you're a coward, you'll never know what love is. Because you never know what vulnerability is. You never know what intimacy is. You never know what opening yourself is.